Welcome to a new episode of Governance This Week. Today we'll talk about climate, and among other things we will be discussing phasing out fossil fuel, risk mitigation strategies, and ways for the European Union to spearhead climate action globally. We are here with Peter Vis, who is a senior research associate at the Florence School of Transnational Governance and also has over 20 years of experience in EU climate policy. Thank you for being here with us today, Peter.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with the COP28. Last time we were in the studio, we discussed with Professor Jos Delbeke about the expectations that we had. What have we learned from the last COP?
Well, the COP in Dubai was a good COP. There's no doubt about that. It made some significant agreements, political agreements, and most notably the one you mentioned to phase out fossil fuels or to transition away from fossil fuels. I don't think there's ever been a COP that has pointed the finger so precisely at fossil fuels as the major cause of climate change. And it did other things as well. It committed politically to tripling the amount of renewable energy in the world by 2030 and doubling the rate of improvement of energy efficiency. So those are big things that were agreed by everybody. And I think that is a significant outcome in itself. Of course, from a more formalistic point of view, this COP was supposed to take stock of where the world is in relation to climate change and comparing the pledges that are made by countries with the outcomes that we're seeing today. And the Global Stocktake, as it was called, concluded, as we might expect, that the countries aren't doing enough. We have to be more ambitious. And so for the next round of pledges by countries, those are the targets set by countries, people will have to be more ambitious in 2025 when the pledges become due. And we've got to work very hard to do more to get to a 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase as a maximum.
So you would agree with the statement that was made at COP28 that this is the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era? And if yes, what's next?
Well, I would like to think the beginning of the beginning of the end started some time ago. I mean, in Europe, we have reduced our emissions quite significantly since climate policies started being introduced in about the early 2000s. The emissions, one of the instruments we use is carbon pricing, is a emissions trading system, which alone has reduced emissions by 32.5% since it began, which is a big reduction. And most of that reduction, of course, is achieved by moving away from fossil fuels. So we've started that move already, but it's got a long way to go. Fossil fuel use is still the major source of energy across the world. That may peak soon, the emissions from fossil fuels. We hope by the end of this decade, certainly, that we'll have been a peaking and that we'll be on a downward trend globally. That would be a significant progress. But I mean, there is more to do everywhere, including in Europe. We've committed to net zero by 2050, but we're only a third of the way there. We have more to do. And of course, we've been doing, I don't want to say it's been easy doing the third that we've reduced emissions by, but the 2/3 that remain are going to be very tough to reduce for sure. But, we hope we can get there.
And let's talk about the European Union. What can be done there? And with the 2023 being the hottest year on record, what do you think are the most crucial priorities for the Union?
We've got to do two things. We have to try to reduce our own emissions, which we're trying to do by strengthening the ambition of policies at the European level and at national level, and even at subnational level. It's a transnational problem, and we need all levels of governance to work together to reduce emissions by making policies more ambitious, by promoting the deployment of renewable energy, by making our houses and more energy efficient, and by our transport choices, which should be more towards the public transport, of course. Electrification of transport is generally much more energy efficient. We should be doing all of those things, and there's much more to do. But also, as well as trying to reduce our emissions, we should also be adapting to climate change, because the climate is going to become hotter because of the fact other parts of the world are growing very fast. Their emissions are still increasing, even if Europe's are decreasing. And it will be some time before global emissions start reducing. And in the meantime, climate change will continue. So that means more extreme weather events, potentially more droughts, more floods, hotter heat waves. And we've got to start factoring that into the resilience of our society. We've got to think about, of course, flood defenses, water scarcity, providing that we have water in dry summers. These are critical issues which we should be planning for now. And the Commission recently published a report on resilience from the adaptation perspective, and it concluded that we're not doing enough and we should be planning to have very hot spells in big cities. And the questions are, how can we attenuate those extreme moments of the year when it's very hot and where potentially there is a risk to, more vulnerable people. So are there places they can go and take refuge that are being kept cooler? Can we plant more vegetation in cities like Florence to keep, to prevent the temperatures rising too high in an extremely hot period? Those are the sorts of things we can do. Of course, there's flood defenses in many places, including in Florence, that has been affected very badly by floods in the past. Is it ready if there were to be very much more rain than planned at a certain moment? Are we learning? Are we planning accordingly? We should be doing, because if we don't plan, we will incur higher costs than are necessary. So prevention is always better than cure, we say in English, and this is a case in point.
During your time at the Commission, you were instrumental in the development of the emission trading system. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, I was in the tax department of the Commission, working on the Energy Products Taxation Directive, which is now called the Energy Taxation Directive. And taxation has to be agreed by all the member states together. Everyone has to be in agreement. And the result of that is it's very difficult to get agreement of everybody, and things don't happen very fast. And so in the 1990s, we tried to get an energy tax adopted in Europe, and it didn't succeed. No, there was never the unanimous agreement. But I went to work for the Environment Department, and after having worked on the tax, the question came up, well, what else can we do? And the emissions trading idea had been planted in the Kyoto Protocol as an instrument that could be used. So I was just in the right place at the right time. I was asked to explore this further. And so I didn't know anything about emissions trading before I started working on it. I read about it. I met people who knew more about it. And with the team I was with, we gradually developed the template for an emissions trading system. Within a couple of years, we'd done a couple of studies, and we published a green paper, which was a sort of a document that allowed everybody to comment on, and the stakeholders all got around the table. At the time, the industry was very open to this idea because they preferred it to a tax. They didn't like the word tax. Industry doesn't, no one really likes paying taxes. But the idea of an emissions trading system appealed more to business. And so we basically were the first area of the world to put an emissions trading system for a greenhouse gas in place. We started progressively. It didn't work very well at the beginning, I'll be honest, but nobody had ever done it before, so we had a lot of learning to do. And today, it is definitely the cornerstone of the climate policies that the European Union has in its toolbox to address climate action.
We have spoken about the policy, Let's move on to private funding and innovation. Do you think that stimulating private investments will make a difference into making Europe more climate resilient?
Definitely, we need to have the public money that's paid, but also private sector money. Yes, we need the private sector to really lean into this problem and invest in things that are going to enable us to decarbonize. How can we do that? Well, there are policies we can do that we can put in place that will incentivize the private sector to invest in climate compatible technologies. One example that we use in Europe and that we'd like to see used more widely across the globe is carbon pricing, the polluter pays principle. In other words, an industry that emits a lot of greenhouse gases has to pay for those emissions. And the beauty of that particular mechanism is that it does generate revenues to governments that they can then use for all sorts of purposes, for investing in projects, innovative projects, for addressing vulnerable households, vulnerable categories of the population who can't afford higher energy prices. So there's not just the paying for the polluting, that is obviously an incentive for a company not to pollute as much because they don't like paying. And that's an encouragement for them to invest in new equipment. And then the revenues that governments receive can actually subsidize some of those investments made by private sector actors. It doesn't necessarily give them all the money they need, but it can co-finance innovative technologies. And that's the sort of way we can put in place a mix of policy instruments and funding that helps us transition faster.
Thank you so much, Peter. So I think we have covered it all. And thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more governance this week.